Good morning, and welcome to CogX. Welcome to CogX 2021. It's great to have you here to this huge extravaganza of leading thinking and technology, and particularly just to make sure this particular session is in the EdTech and education stream or stage. So it's great to have you here. It's certainly a great lineup we've got for today, and looking forward to a number of the speakers. So education and EdTech is the session that I participated in over the last few years at CogX, and I think couldn't be more important now. We've obviously had a devastating, well, more than a year now, year and a half of COVID, but of course, by the same token, that devastation has caused huge amounts of innovation. We know, 3 years worth of technology adoption in 3 months, and huge changes have actually happened. So, but of course, it's been devastating not just for the whole economy, but for the education system itself, and the things that both children and students have had to put up with now have been pretty fundamental. So the question really is for this first panel, which is a very exciting couple of folks who are going to be on this first panel, is what have we learned and what's here to stay? So can we, we're going to discuss some of the far-reaching effects, but also to look at, what's going to emerge as we go forward, and what are the advantages we can really take and the lessons we can learn. So I'm delighted to have my 2 participants today. The first of those is Lisa Witter, who is the founder and chief exec of Apolitical, which is a really interesting organization at the kind of boundary of government, data, and technology. So Lisa, welcome, and great to have you here today. And I think you're going to come on live. And Lisa is going to be interviewing Andreas Schleicher, who is the director for education and skills at the OECD, who have clearly been right at the heart of this conversation for many years and continue to be so. So, Lisa, I'm going to hand over to you. Have a great session. Hopefully you can get everyone excited for the day at CogX, and I'm sure you will, but thanks very much, and look forward to seeing you at the end of the session.
Thanks, Phil. Thanks for your leadership in this topic over the years. What a fascinating year to be talking about education and what we've learned. I can't think of a person in the world that hasn't had their life sort of disrupted, either as a parent or as an uncle or as a student themselves with this topic. And really excited to be joined by those of you around the world who are watching, whether you're EdTech entrepreneurs or people in government, or folks who just work in technology. Really excited, and I'm very much looking forward to the questions part. So I am Lisa Witter, as Phil said, and I'm the co-founder of Apolitical. We're a global peer-to-peer learning platform and network for public servants, those hard people that help keep the lights on during COVID and still are in 170 countries. Really proud to be working with public servants during this time. And I also have moved to be the CEO of our foundation, which works on the next generation of citizen politicians. So these young people who are coming out of education systems, going into democracy to serve. So for me, this is a really important topic for the overall democracy flywheel that we work on here at Apolitical. And I'm a mom of 2 kids who have seen this sort of live about how this happened. So I'm really excited to be here with really one of the world, we can get sort of the best world's leading expert on this topic, Andreas Schleicher. He's the director for education and skills and a special advisor on education policy to the Secretary General of the OECD. For those of you who don't know, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, based in Paris. And what a job he has. For more than 20 years, he has worked with ministers and education leaders to not only sort of adapt to the way that the world changed to Industry 4.0, but also during this COVID time. And he initiated and oversaw and oversees the PISA. So this is a program for international student assessment that looks at international instruments so that policymakers and those of us know how we're performing. This is all happening while we're thinking about the future of work, how technology has disrupted the future of jobs. So what an important time. Just a little bit of background, he studied physics in Germany and received a degree in mathematics and statistics in Australia. And he's won numerous awards for his commitment to this work. So Andreas, join me on the virtual stage. I'm going to ask you, I want to personalize this just a bit. So we just had all of the great things about your background, but let's talk about you for a second. Can you give us an example of how a teacher impacted your life, or something that a teacher did that really informs how you think about the situation today?
Well, as you just said, I started my career as a scientist, but then I had to do my civil service, and they actually sent me for 2 years to a school with disadvantaged children. And it did change my outlook on life, on everything. And, that's why you find me today working on education. So I had, this has been the kind of experience that, got me into this. And but I also had extraordinary teachers. At the beginning, my education was a bit bumpy, but then I found, a music teacher, who really taught me to love to learn and to study hard and to sort of be, music is a great way to develop, skills where you have to listen, where you have to position yourself in a bigger picture, and to learn to sort of be resilient. And actually that I'm very grateful for that. It really made my education a lot smoother afterwards.
Yeah, well, I think you're probably not giving yourself as much credit. Didn't you go on to be be in the German youth orchestra, right? That teacher must have really impacted you.
Absolutely. And that, again, was my first international experience. I was able to work with students and children from all over the world. And actually, but once again, I didn't speak, any foreign language, but I could work with people from other places, other countries, through that, language of music. It was an amazing experience. And actually before you couldn't get me to work for 20 minutes on my homework, and I practiced 3 hours to be ready for the next day.
Well, talk about the power of teachers, right? From going from a young man who didn't want to do your homework to being a teacher. Those teachers have been out of the classroom with the kids for the most part in most places around the world. And that's what we really want to talk about now. This would be an interesting panel if there wasn't COVID, as we think about the future of work and the rise of robots and AI. But during the time of COVID, even more interesting. So let me start off by asking, in a word, to encapsulate, followed by an explanation, what's the state of education across the world? I know that's a big question, but at the OECD, you have this bird's eye view. So what's the state of education today?
Maybe I would use the word, suspense. We know the old industrial model of education is no longer working. It's losing its relevance, but we don't yet know quite how the future of education will look like. And, this isn't just about COVID. Long before this pandemic, the kind of things that were easy to teach and test also became easy to digitize, to automate. We were good at educating second-class robots, people who are good at repeating what we tell them. But I think we are still starting to figure out, what will make us first-class humans, and what can education contribute to this. So suspense for me is that kind of word that captures that.
Suspense. Well, I want to give the audience some suspense. I'm going to ask you more questions about robots as we come. But if we talk about suspense and we talk about COVID, what do you think the biggest challenge has been? We'll get to the bright spots, but what's been the hardest part for systems or people, do you think, to adapt to what COVID has meant for students and families?
Maybe the lack of resilience in our structures in education. Our education systems are designed to filter ideas top down, but the lack of frontline capacity, teachers, capable to redesign learning environments, students able to sort of learn in different environments with different kind of technologies. This education system served as well in a stable environment, but the moment the future became unexpected, it broke down. And I think that's, I believe, still a challenge with us. We are very, very good at pushing ideas into schools. We are not so great in finding the good ideas and, scaling and spreading them. And I think that's something that this crisis, I think has really exposed. So that's also why it has just dramatically amplified the many inequalities in our education systems. And they did exist before, but we could live with that. And now during this pandemic, actually, they have just become, extraordinary challenges. Now, if you had learned to learn, as a student, if you had access to great digital technology, teachers, taking care of you, supportive environment at home, maybe this pandemic has not been so difficult. But if you were, used to be spoon-fed by your teachers, you did not have access to alternative learning opportunities, no parents to support you, you were just badly left behind.
Yeah, I remember we did a study of public servants around the world about what COVID meant for them, right? Early days and then 3 or 4 months on. And they were saying they needed to learn how to work online. They didn't have resilience with the flexibility or even the tools to do so. And you think about those teachers, and it kind of makes us think about, okay, how do we want to support the workforce in general? Is it command and control down, or is it creating that sense of self-agency up for the students, but also for the teachers? But I know there have been bright spots in all of this. I know there's been, stories about kids left behind, not getting food, or, not having books to read, or all these things you talked about. But before we go to the darkness, where are the bright spots that you've seen? What systems have adapted, and what have we learned from that?
Well, I think apart from specific systems, I think there have been positive developments. First of all, I think we have seen that education can change. Education is an inherently conservative social enterprise, and sometimes we as parents, we are part of the problem, not part of the solution. We just get very anxious when our children no longer learn what was very important for us, or when they do learn things that we no longer understand. Teachers are often more likely to teach how they were taught than how they were taught to teach what they know about modern pedagogy. But, in this pandemic, we have seen more technological, but also more social innovation in a year than probably in a decade before. Second, I think we have seen that parents become part of the solution, are no longer just part of the problem from the perspective of teachers. The schools have reached out to them, made them actually part of the learning organization, the learning environment. And I think parents have also seen, what the work of teachers is like. So I think there's much greater appreciation. Education is becoming more a kind of whole of society enterprise. We are thinking more flexibly about the spaces, the technology, the people. And I think that's a great, accomplishment. And then also teachers have grown beyond, becoming instructors. They have also, become great coaches, great mentors, great facilitators, great social workers. Now, all of that, I think, are a development on which we can build. The social acceptance of technology. I must say the technology itself that was deployed in the pandemic was quite, limiting, actually. It was largely about, conserving existing practice. We haven't used the kind of technology that really will transform education practice. If we're honest, I think it's pretty much, just a stopgap measure. But the social acceptance of that, that technology can be part of the learning environment. I think that's a new development. And then, of course, yes, there are bright spots. So you can look at Estonia, the poster child for digitalization in education. For them, actually, this was just, one more challenge, and they were very, very good at adapting because they had a lot of frontline capacity. But let me, highlight another bright spot that is much less known. Take a country like India. If you look at television these days, you see, these heartbreaking pictures of, the COVID pandemic, destroying everything. What you don't see is the millions and millions of learners who actually learn on India's quite amazing learning platform, Diksha. And actually, it has cut through layers and layers of bureaucracy, actually connecting students at the front line in remote villages with modern learning content, with competency-based learning, things that probably without the pandemic would have been very, very hard to reach there because, of this very kind of sclerotic kind of bureaucratic system. So also that we shouldn't overlook that actually the pandemic has, broken through many of the structures that actually have hindered progress. So again, I think you find interesting China, the use of artificial intelligence, amazing kind of learning technologies being deployed now, and teachers becoming researchers, designers. If you look at teachers in China, they spend a fair bit of their time not just teaching students, but also advancing the learning environment, the design of new technology. So I think there are many really interesting bright spots.
So what's going to stick? I mean, I know you don't, have a crystal ball into the future, but there are many of us are worried that this hasn't been long enough. Of course, the suffering's been too long, but for the real transformation to stick, what's going to stick and what do you think won't?
Well, that's a hard question. No, actually, we should never underestimate that the status quo in education just has many, many protectors. There's a great risk that we all get back to our pre-COVID habits. But, I'm pretty confident that you're going to find a lot of young people, a lot of students who are going to go back to their teachers and say, look, listen, I've learned to learn in so many more interesting ways, in so many different ways. Actually, I took responsibility for my own learning in ways that I've never done before. Can we keep some of this? And I think you're going to see, many teachers going back to their school leaders saying, well, this was a difficult moment, but I have, grown beyond myself. I'm no longer just, teaching a government prepared curriculum, but I've learned to design my own learning materials, my own learning environments. I've learned to collaborate with my colleagues to, innovate learning environments. I've learned to use interesting new technologies. Can we do that a lot more so? And I think you're going to see a lot of school leaders who are going to go back to the system and saying, well, in this moment, the system has pretty much left us on our own devices. It was not, a great system of support, but we have figured this out. We have built a community of schools and we have built linkages with our, communities around us. So I think, this momentum, I think, is there. And I have great hopes that it will, stick.
That's great. I love the optimism. I'm really betting on that for the future. And I really like the idea of kids going in and saying, we want it differently, and really bringing that voice in. One thing that you've worked on in your career is PISA, and maybe you could explain a bit to our listeners what PISA is. I've been quite interested in the role of standardized testing during these times, right? And how that links to mental health. And so I'm curious, sort of, where do you think standardized testing going? I know in my home state of Washington State, we've dropped the standardized testing requirement to go into university, which is different, I know, than PISA, because it's been seen as unfair for a long time, but also like the stress of that during this time, so testing and grades. So I'd love your thoughts on sort of the future of standardized testing, and what of this mental health concern that we have for teachers and for students, what do you think will stick? You talked about teachers becoming social workers. I know teachers calling up their kids, just asking how they're doing, right? So what about the mental health is going to change, do you think, in schools? And what about standardized testing?
Yeah, maybe first on the standardized testing, actually, I think this pandemic has shown us how much more important it actually is for schools and teachers to have reliable insights into the cognitive, the social, the emotional development of their students. When you have them in front of you in the classroom, well, you have a kind of intuitive knowledge, maybe. But when they are, learning at home, you basically, struggle to find out, where are my students? Who are they? Who do they want to become? And in that sense, I think assessment will become more important. But at the same time, I think the pandemic did expose the weaknesses of our current systems of assessment. In one way, I would say, one of the greatest kind of drawbacks of education on the last, few hundred years was that we have more or less divorced learning and assessment. Now we ask students to pile up years and years and years of learning. And then, one day we say, come back and tell me everything in a very contrived, artificial, constrained environment. Now, and then, when that day schools are closed, we don't know how to do this. Sort of the system has broken down. What I am confident in is that actually technology now allows us to reintegrate learning and assessment, now making them, two sides of the same coin, so that students get more immediate, more real feedback on how they are progressing, that teachers get better data on how different students learn differently and can then adapt their pedagogic strategies, and that school systems get better and real-time data on how schools are progressing. So actually, I think, assessment is not becoming less important, it's becoming more important. And I think if we do get the tools to do it better, faster, and in more real time. Now, why should a student, and PISA is a good example, with digital assessment now, we are no longer just asking students, to repeat the results of an experiment. They can actually do that experiment in a kind of virtual simulated setting. So I think actually here is perhaps one of the biggest transformations that we can see in the next years, when learning and assessment really reunite to give people better insights, making learning much more adaptive, much more granular, much more interactive. So I think this kind of pandemic has reminded us that we need to not just, rethink our models of learning, but also our models of assessment and exams. You combine that with blockchain technology, with other technologies, and you can see really a revolution happening. But you mentioned another point, and that is also that in our assessments, we need to take a more holistic perspective. Now, success is not just about the accumulation of, cognitive outcomes. The social and emotional outcomes are equally important. And by the way, in our PISA assessment, now we are trying to sort of capture some of those aspects. Now we looked at students' collaborative problem-solving skills some time ago. We have just, developed measures of social interaction, of resilience, and so on. And I do think this is very important that we start to capture a broader range of outcomes that are relevant to the well-being of students, to their future economic and their social development, and to get a little bit away from the narrow reproduction of subject matter content that used to be the focus of assessment, simply because that was so easy to do. Now we need, in a way, to design our assessments such that they look at those aspects that are really important for success in school and in life, not just what is easy to capture and to measure. And once again, I believe that technology is actually at a very good point to get us there.
I want to ask a little bit, drill down into the technology a bit as you talk about assessment. Are you seeing any trends on biofeedback, measuring cortisol levels or adrenaline levels? Because, I have one kid who's super nervous taking tests, and I know that's the nervousness that is driving as much as the outcome as the ability. And I could imagine for a lot of kids, we need to know more about what's going on in their bodies physically. Are you seeing technology in that area helping get a better sort of holistic physical view of what's going on with kids?
Absolutely, and it starts actually with simpler things like eye tracking software, and you can sort of capture emotions of students. I think there's a lot of ways how we can better, measure students' kind of attitudes and well-being directly. But there's also another aspect. Once again, why is your daughter nervous? Because once again, this divorce of learning and assessment. Now in one day I have to show everything I can do in a very kind of artificial environment. If assessment becomes part of the learning process every day, every moment, and it serves ourselves, we get those insights. It's not just I have to prove something to someone else, but actually I will get better insights on where I can develop. We will lose that nervousness. So it's not just about, technology being able to capture it. Yes, we can. But also, the assessment itself changing so that it becomes, part of our learning process. Children don't get nervous when they play computer games, where you get a constant assessment, because it is part of that, process of learning. And you become better in that way, and they know that. And I think that's, for me, the more important part than simply just measuring emotions. But again, there is amazing technology available now.
So, this all sounds great. Andreas, you're so positive. There are bright spots in the future. But I know how politics work, and there seems to be a big gap between where we can be. We're going to get to where we could be in the future, but like sort of where you're talking the frontiers are now, and where the reality is for people. We feel like we have a political problem or some sort of gap, right, between possibility and reality. Could you talk a little bit about that? I mean, you work with education ministers around the world. I'm sure they're involved with teachers unions, school districts, all these different levels and different. What's the barrier to having this be better, faster for kids everywhere? Is it money?
Well, I'm not sure about resources alone. Probably it's a lot more to do with how we deploy resources, how we balance, investments in spaces, in people, in time, in technology. Teachers will always be reluctant to implement change where they haven't been part of the design of change. So I do think, part of the answer lies to actually, integrate teachers much better in the design of new technology and the design of new learning environments, to give teachers more time, not just to be instructors, but also to be researchers, designers, work with, tech companies, ensure that technology, that pedagogy is at the heart of new technology. So I think, where this is happening, you do see teachers having very, very different attitudes to this. Now, that's part of the issue. If you want to get people along to implement change, you have to bring them along on designing change. I also think, we have to look at the gateways in education. If you tell teachers, well, teach your young people to be creative, to be imaginative, to be social, to be collaborative, and then you say, well, at the end of the day, I'm just looking at whether they are good in math and science and maybe language, then, you send mixed signals to teachers. Yeah. And again, we have to look at those kinds of gateways. And if we adapt those gateways to the demands of the modern world, I think, behavior will change as well. If we strengthen the connection with, parents, where, we are not looking at, in one way, I think what's been unhelpful over the last years is that there's been a trend to sort of commodifying education. Students became consumers, parents became clients, teachers became service providers, and that's created an unhealthy distance between everyone. Now, schools became very good to keep students inside and the rest of the world outside. And again, I think we got to, build better linkages. And I think if we do, people will become more open to change. So I actually, and I'm not dreaming this up. I actually look at around the world. Some education systems are on a very, very fast track, and they're not always the most advanced ones. Sometimes education, from in a very difficult context today, are actually making enormous strides to not just, improve what they do, but really transform what they do. So I think actually the potential is there, but it's often a matter of, how do we engage and manage the stakeholders who are involved.
I think it's a really good point. I mean, I see in government a big trend is some crazy idea called human-centered design, which is actually just putting citizens. And what you're saying is in the education system, we need to put teachers, and help that have them co-create. And another point you make that I see quite problematic is when people take a private sector mindset and they put it on a public good. That's not to say that you can't learn from the private sector, but it's different. You have an ecosystem of different stakeholders. So I want to ask a question, because CogX is about bringing those people together. The private sector, you have, ed tech folks on here, public sector, education, journalists, all of that. I want to ask you sort of, what do we need to know for the future, in collaboration? Like, where do you see this? If we get back together in 10 years, what do you wish was happening in the collaboration between the sectors that's not, and where's the possibility of where it can go?
Well, when we look at collaboration between the sectors, it's mostly focused on the how. It's on the methodology, on the learning environment. So actually, I wish in 10 years' time, we will be much more deeply engaged with on the what question. Mm-hmm. In a way, I think unless we have a good, societal understanding, what are we learning for? What are the cognitive, social, emotional competencies that actually we need in our, societies, in our economies, in our futures? I think that kind of overall framing conversation for me is crucially important. Today, we leave that to a handful of experts somewhere in government, maybe some researchers who design a curriculum. We don't have that kind of stakeholder conversation about this. And I think that is what I think needs to be different in the future, that we have a much deeper conversation between those who develop skills, like teachers, those who use skills, like employers, but also other players in society, to think more about, how do we complement, not substitute, the artificial intelligence we've created in our computers today. And I think what makes us human. I think those are questions that I hope will be much more at the center, and then they can drive the question. If we have a really good understanding of the what, then we can work together on thinking about what kind of learning environments are going to best support those competencies. Then, we can think about what kind of people do we need, to actually sustain those learning environments? What's the role of teachers, other kind of professionals? Maybe, the future is not just about, one size fits all teachers, but we'll have lots of professionals from different kind of orientations. And then, you can ask yourself, what kind of work organization would you need to make that not just, financially attractive, but also intellectually attractive? How are you going to get the best people, the best and brightest actually to become, the designers, the educators of tomorrow's systems? And I think in a way, inverting that conversation from starting out, how do we tweak the current system towards what do we want to achieve, I think will help greatly to make this a more meaningful conversation.
Fantastic. So we have 10 minutes left. So I just want to make sure that the listeners send questions our way for Andreas about, the future of education. I asked in our little interview, I love music. You love music. We both love music. If there was a song title of advice that you could give people working in this sector, do you have one? Do you have like a song title of advice that you could give to people?
I'm not sure I have a song title of advice. I actually think it's a combination of professional autonomy and a collaborative culture, where we all are seen as part of that solution. I think that will help transform education. Now we need to get out of that really industrial mindset that we still have. That served us well, in an age where we all needed to be similar and have the same kind of, skills for specific tasks. But in the future of artificial intelligence, I think that human nature will become so much more.
Are you back? Am I back?
Yes.
We're back. Super. Sorry, the internet in Berlin may have given me a hiccup. As you were talking about some song titles, I was thinking about the song title "Pump Up the Jam" by Salt and Pepper, which is, I think what you're talking about is like we need to raise up the jam. And when I say jam, that means like the sectors working together and not focused on Mr. Roboto, right? That we're not looking at robots to be the future, although there may be augmented teaching in some ways. We're seeing this in Japan with dealing with older people. And I'm thinking a lot about, as you're talking about younger people and learning, how much unlearning and learning we need to do as adults to continue to adapt, and how important the brain science is around all of this to do that. Let's make sure we leave folks, as we have a few more questions. Do you have 3 books that you would recommend, or 3 like sources where you go to get inspiration or sort of recommendation for folks to learn more about this, or just something you've read recently that's really moved you in this space?
One book that really challenged a lot of my thinking is, and really, influenced me a lot, is Homo Deus from Harari. I think, I would recommend to anyone, because it shows us, if we do not, change course, where we will or could end up as humans, becoming really, not the masters of algorithms, but the slaves of algorithms, where technology would not, superempower us, but actually, disempower us. And I think that was something, we should take to heart when we design, tomorrow's curricula, tomorrow's learning environment. At least for me, it was a very, very kind of instructive reading.
Did you happen to read Humankind by Bergman, who talked about? Oh yeah, well, I think it's a lot in line what you're talking about, Andreas, is about how what we know through psychology is that often people are the product of their environments. And how important it is to build learning environments that bring out the best of people versus the Lord of the Flies, if I were to talk about another one, and what an opportunity and how much we've seen education change to build those more sort of safe, inclusive environments in this era of, rapid change. So I really recommend that one. If you want a bit of optimism on a dark day, I think that could be a good one. I want to go back a little bit just on the technology, because we have so many people here listening to us on the tech. Where are the, again, you don't have a crystal ball, but if you could like build products, or where are the holes in technology that you see an opportunity for entrepreneurs to move into? And I mean entrepreneurs with heart who actually really care. We've seen a real uptake in edtech funds and money into the edtech space coming in this last year. We're in the edtech space, so we watch this quite carefully. But where are some of the gaps, or where are some of the trends in edtech that we should be watching?
If I look at the edtech I see today, too much for me is about, just conserving existing practice and supporting existing practice. Too little is really about, changing the way we learn. And I see much more space for, artificial intelligence in education. It is there, but it's still, again, for tutoring purposes. It's not yet used to help people really understand, how they learn, what their kind of strengths are, their weaknesses are, where they have a passion, where they get, where they struggle. I think, using artificial intelligence to make learning more reflective, more interactive, more participative, I think will be very important. That is also true for teachers. Learning analytics at the moment is still in its infancy. I think there's so much potential to give teachers more granular, more personal feedback about how different students learn differently, and then not, to provide shallow advice to teachers, but just, to give them good diagnostics. Yeah. I do think, we should expect the teachers to be the experts, to make good judgments, but we should give them, the best possible support, the best possible insight into this. I do see a future even for robots in classrooms. I think they can make learning more fun. If you learn a language with a robot, it's much better than if you learn lists of vocabularies. And actually, I think, children, particularly smaller ones, tend to be quite, attached to this. So I think there is space for this to complement teachers. I think, blockchain is at its infancy also today. Again, most of the edtech is about replicating existing exams and assessments, but, we could give people so much more ownership over what they learn, how they learn, when they learn, where they learn. We could, unbundle educational content, delivery, and accreditation, the kind of monopolies that we've created in our universities. Blockchain technologies could actually, give people the empowerment to learn throughout their lives and to be able to demonstrate what they have learned and to show that, and to learn informally, formally, not, just to pass through specific institutional pathways. So much potential. But, I think the current edtech sector is too much focused on how we can, support the existing way of learning rather than to really change and transform it. In a way, I think the last year has shown us that learning is not a place, it's an activity, and that activity is about, this attitude, this motivation to learn throughout your life. We used to learn to do the work, that was the education of the past. Today, learning is the work in a kind of lifelong, life-wide perspective. And again, I think there's just tremendous potential for technology to serve us better in the field of education. I think other sectors have actually done that. And I think a big part of this is also the policy environment. We have a very fragmented market for educational technology. As a school, basically, you have to navigate a very complicated sector with a lack of standardization, with a lack of interoperability, with a lack of, compatibility. You have to buy into kind of specific, often proprietary solutions. So nothing what you do is compatible with what people do in other places. So we cannot harness the resulting data of this. And then, basically this market only suits very large providers, who have an army of salespeople who can bring their products to all the kind of atomized school market. Entrepreneurs, innovators, it's very, very hard for them to get into this. So I think there are a lot of areas where I think we can and we need to do better.
I really like this. I hear a lot from edtech entrepreneurs and entrepreneurs in general. The reason why they are not disruptive is because people won't buy the disruption. And so they're left with not the vision that they want for the future, but they're left selling the status quo with some tech packaging. So I think there's a bunch of work that government needs to do on that interoperability and making the procurement process really not just owned by the big guys, although they're doing great stuff, but also that there's more flexibility and innovation. And I'm seeing really good stuff happening in procurement. It's just not happening fast enough. So I want to thank you very much. And we're going to have Phil come up here, but we really covered the range from robots to the bright spots. And my favorite thing that you said is We used to learn for work, and now learning is the work. And everyone at CogX today, you're here because you're doing the work of learning. As adults, we owe it to the future to continue to learn ourselves, and you being part of this today is part of that. So Andreas, thank you for your life work. Keep pushing us, keep optimistic, and look forward to seeing where this goes and for all of us being a part of it. So Phil, over back to you.
Thanks, Lisa.
Yeah, thank you, Lisa and Andreas. That was fabulous. Really great start to the day. I mean, I picked up that quote as well, that learning is the work. I thought it was great. Also, of course, your comment about pump up the jam, which I thought was great. I could see you and Andreas engaging with that. But that was a really thoughtful session. And I think the thoughtful nature of you really thinking about the human factors, the technological factors, and the social factors of education really was very powerful, you know, and I think there was some great takeaways from there. And I think I love the kind of openness of the way you're thinking about this, Andreas, and the examples you've seen from around the world is really inspiring. So thank you so much for that. I really appreciate it. And obviously, folks, you know, keep engaging with this topic. I'm sure Andreas and Lisa, you know, are not going to rest at this point. So it's been great to have you here today. I really appreciate the effort that's gone into it. And I think it is a super start to our EdTech and education session for the day. And I'm sure there'll be a lot more discussion about some of these areas as we go on through the day. So thanks, folks. Good to see you again today, and we'll be in touch, I'm sure.
Pump up the jam. Pump it up.
Pump the jam. Yeah. Let's all do it, you know, by the end of the day.
Thanks, everyone.
Okay, thanks a lot. Okay, thank you, everybody. That was a tremendous session. I think we're completed now, and as far as I know, we're finishing the session, and we should be able to move on to the next session. We've got a great session coming up next, hosted by Nesta, which will, you know, be a live session actually in
Wow.
in the session. So great stuff.